Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first installation of the 2015 Surge series, and thank you for joining us today or later. I'm Claire Butterfield. I'm the Program Director at the Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Foundation, or ISEIF. To date, our grantees are the country's only non-utility community of practice working on smart grid education, and this year we're going to be sharing our insights in a series of conversations focused on unanswered questions about the energy future. We're kicking that off with a general question. What does success look like? Utilities have promised the smart grid as a pathway to clean, reliable, and safe electricity, but what does that mean for residential consumers? I'm joined today by two organizations working to understand and accelerate the energy future. Brewster McCracken is the CEO of Pecan Street, based in Austin, Texas. And our featured grantee today is Foresight Design Initiative, represented by their executive director, Peter Nicholson. If you're currently watching on Google Hangouts and want to learn more about ISEIF and our guests' organizations, there are links under the showcase bar on the right-hand side. If you are joining us today on YouTube, just click on the box in the lower left-hand corner that says Be a Part of the Conversation, and you'll get switched over to the Hangout page. If you'd like to submit a question from the Hangout page, click on the little white grid in the upper right corner of the screen and switch from Showcase to the Q&A app. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for any questions. If you're watching this later on YouTube, this does not apply to you. So for those who aren't familiar with the topic, I wanted to start by asking each of you, starting with Brewster, what a successful smart grid looks like for a residential consumer. How does it improve their lives? How does it make life better at both the individual and the community level?
I think a good analogy in this would be what's happened with mobile phone networks. So what is success for a consumer on a mobile phone network is if they can make a call, watch a video, send a text message or an email, share content through the cloud, in their mobile phone network or their grid is able to handle that. So looking at that on the electricity side, how would that translate? What would success look like? Well, the big trend lines that we're seeing are that consumers, they make choices, and is the grid able to serve consumers and the choices they make? Consumers are introducing new products in their home. The big one, obviously, is solar panels. That produces a ton of challenges for the traditional electric grid operations. So as consumers start introducing things like this into their home, those are things that utilities may have not a ton of control over, and the question will be, can they successfully provide reliable service at an affordable cost for consumers as they introduce these new products inside their home?
So how have you empowered your participants at Pecan Street, Brewster, to realize these benefits, and how have those benefits affected their energy usage and their behavior?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There are two kinds of behavior the one looks at. One behavior is what do you choose to buy? What purchasing decisions do you make? Do you choose to buy a new product? Do you choose to buy services for that product? And then the second kind of behavior to look at is, well, how do you use the stuff you already have? There's been a lot of focus on how do we get people to alter their behavior with what they already have, change how they use their existing air conditioner. That kind of stuff is actually really difficult to change because people's behavior patterns on how they use what they already have is because those behaviors can be pretty entrenched and kind of difficult. And the other one that's of a lot of interest in the consumer electronics world is how do you get people to change their behavior in terms of buying stuff they don't have already, including buying service. If you're a car maker, how do you get them to buy service, maintenance services, things like that? So what we've done on that is the ability for consumers to be empowered is directly related to the power of the tools they have access to, feedback tools. For example, if you go to an elevator and you push the arrow button to go down and the light doesn't come on, what's the first thing you do?
Push it again.
Push it again. We rely on the light on the button to give us feedback. We successfully executed that option. It means that the tool of the button has to provide some feedback. Well, if we wait 30 to 45 days for feedback on our actions in the electric use like we traditionally do with our bills, consumers have a very, they don't have a very robust tool to have information on the impact of their actions. So we get people apps, real-time access to their data down to the appliance level, and then we also build in value-added services on top of that to see what people need and want and like. And, through all that, we're managing as much electric use data every day as a utility that has 1 hour AMI and has 4 million residential customers. So we're managing a lot of data from a national scale, probably the third most electric use data every day in the state of Texas, here at our data center on the second floor of where I am today. And with that data, it takes advantage of advances in cloud computing and mobile application software, get people real-time access to services that really haven't had access to before.
Can you give us a concrete example? What's somebody in one of the houses around you that's participating in your project? How are they accessing that data? Are they picking up their smartphone?
Yeah, we've tried it out with a web portal and a smartphone app. And interestingly, for most people, they don't really use a website for this kind of interaction because people just want their stuff to work. It appears from what we're seeing that the dynamic of a successful interaction model is something more like a vehicle telematics service or an alarm system, where you get an alert over your smartphone if something's not working as it should, and so you have that kind of interaction. So yeah, people don't interact on an hourly basis with their home alarm system from Vivint or ADT, but that doesn't mean that that product is not valuable to the customer. It's just that they know that whether it's a vehicle telematics service like OnStar or a home alarm service like from ADT or Vivint, that even though they're not interacting with that mobile application all the time, they know that because that application's on their smartphone, they will be alerted if there's a problem. And that seems to be the sweet spot for what people want to interact when it comes to their products that use electricity, gas, or water.
So they want to know when something's going wrong or when they've exceeded their budget for the month. That's the kind of update they want to get.
Yeah, I'll give you a concrete example. We have a little bit over 1,200 residents around the United States in 10 states participating in our research, and about 300 of them have rooftop solar panels. We found in our research with customers who had real-time access to their home energy use and to their solar panel performance over a web portal that they weren't discovering when they had simple little maintenance issues that knocked their solar panels partially or completely offline, sometimes for months at a time. They just didn't know because they lost interest in engaging with their solar panel use after a few weeks. So we created a mobile app that sends them an alert now if there's something wrong with their solar panels so they can quickly get their systems back online. Usually for anywhere from $0 to $25. It doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, customers just weren't finding out about it, and they were thereby losing most of the value of their solar panels during that period.
Mm-hmm. So the data is of value to consumers, but only if it's delivered in mechanisms they'll actually use.
Exactly. They don't want to become data miners or data scientists. They don't want to become the day trader version of electric users. They just want to have that data translated into some useful, fairly immediate pieces of information that they can act on.
Mm-hmm.
Real quick, there is there's a flip on that because consumers don't want to engage. If you can get them to sign on to a service, such as an example is demand response. Demand response leverages the typical consumer behavior that they don't want to interact unless there's a problem, and so they will let a system do its work without overriding it. Whereas something like a time of use price, which requires more conscious engagement, that is not likely to be as effective and is turning out generally not to be as effective as something like demand response, which leverages people's general lack of bandwidth to kind of data mine their electric use.
So just to translate that for folks who maybe don't have their heads in energy 24/7, what you're saying is that a utility rate that somehow automatically reduces demand, like an AC cycling program, is more effective than a price variant based on time of day?
Yes. Now, anything that is automated is going to typically be more effective than something that requires a customer to consciously engage with something on a repeated basis for it to achieve its value. So it is possible, for example, to devise a time of use rate and have an automated setting on a thermostat that was triggered by that rate. But that would be an example not of the rate being the successful indicator, but instead the automated function on the thermostat. So if you look at automated processes, those will generally be more effective because they don't require the customer to repeatedly and consciously engage. It's the old blinking VCR clock syndrome.
So, okay, thank you. Yeah, people prefer the set and forget. So the decision that you want is one decision to sign up for that program versus a program that requires many different decisions over time.
Exactly.
Well, Peter, I want to just turn to you now for a second and ask, what are the most likely scenarios for how the smart grid might evolve based on the research you've been working on for us? And what changes do you think residential consumers are going to see in the coming years?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Those are great questions. As you know, we've looked at all of the smart grid rollouts across the United States a year or two ago, and continue to look at great programs like Pecan Street program, San Diego Gas Electric, these sort of leading utilities that are trying to make progress with their grid. And I think for folks who might not know what the smart grid is, it's always good to give a little bit of background, where this is this idea of, as I like to say, you're putting a communication layer, right, a two-way communication layer on the grid. So a dumb grid, of course, is a grid where you don't have that kind of communication layer. And of course, the beneficiary of the primary beneficiary of this is initially greater grid reliability, particularly for the utility, where they can tell on the grid where there's outages and where there's not outages. Whereas it always catches people by surprise. Right now, people don't realize that the electric company does not have a lot of granularity in terms of looking at that grid reliability. Unless you make a phone call, oftentimes they won't know that the power is out to your house or to your neighborhood. So in a certain sense, this two-way communication function is a really interesting, in terms of grid reliability, a key component to it for storms, for making sure the power, because they can oftentimes route electricity around outages, kind of like the internet works in more of a web. And so understanding that basic concept is like, well, where can that go, right? And where can that go, and how can that benefit the consumer side? It's like, here's the benefit for utilities in terms of grid reliability. The benefit utility also in terms of they don't have to go to your house to read your meter anymore. They're getting that information in quasi-real time, right? As Brewster just commented, you know, there's these new data streams. Where does the home residential customer benefit from it? And I think there's a couple different answers to that, and where this is going, or this is hopefully going, as what we were looking at it. I think, you know, again, I think Brewster, you touched on this point, is people don't want to manage the electricity, right? And they're not, and as we found out in our research, it's at least in this country, in different parts of the country, different rates, it's relatively cheap. Specifically here in Chicago, it's very cheap, relatively speaking. People aren't used to thinking about it at all. They're used to having it there. They're not used to managing, let alone thinking about it. And they're not aware of the environmental impact, necessarily, of their energy. If that's something that happens far away, if at all, we don't realize that coal-fired power plants and mercury and lead and all these things that are going into the air feed our energy response. So where is that all going? I think that's going to a set of services. I think we're in this sort of transition period right now where we're seeing sort of a little bit of sort of tumult, if you will, where we're trying to figure out what's the future going to be and how are residential customers going to engage with this two-way communication system. Utilities know how they're going to engage with it. They're going to be able to look at power outages. They're going to be able to read your meter without going there. But what's the consumer going to do? And the best example, one of the examples I always give to talk about people about the potential of this is, you know, take this scenario where you're at home and suddenly there's a knock on your door, right? and there's the grocery delivery service, and you didn't even order any deliveries, and you ordered any groceries, but there was a sensor in your refrigerator that was measuring how much milk you needed, and realized you needed more milk, you need more of this, sent the order to your grocery delivery service, it shows up at your door, you open the refrigerator, oh, look, it was right. And that could all be done potentially over your having a super smart appliance. That's potentially somewhat far in the future, but not too far-fetched in the future. To me, the question is what does success look like, and for who? And I think that's a really key point, because oftentimes when we talk about success, the assumption is we're talking about people who can afford new technologies, who can afford new appliances, who can afford their energy bill right now. And I think we also have to look at what does success look like for low-income folks. And it's across a couple different things. I think success looks like across the reliability of the energy system, especially when we're getting greater storm events, particularly here in Chicago, and climate change is tending to potentially cause these greater storm events. So grid reliability on the consumer side, are we going to get our energy when we want it? I think the other issue is cost, and being able to control our costs and manage our costs, and I think that's Pecan Street is doing some really amazing work on that front with demand response, with real-time pricing, this kind of cost control. And then I think the third thing that we don't talk a lot about is environmental impact. How can we, what is the reason for energy efficiency ultimately is reducing this environmental impact, whether that's through renewable energy, whether that's through energy efficiency, or some combination thereof. How this is all going to get played out, I think, is a really interesting question, because I think, and Bruce, I'd be curious about your opinion on this, we're kind of in the Wild West right now. It's just starting to happen. We're in the middle of a paradigm shift, and this two-way communication function is kind of the leverage point. It's inserting a new thing into this energy grid that we didn't have before, and the ramifications could be pretty profound.
Brewster, did you just want to, I want to give you a chance to respond to that before I go to my next question.
Yeah, my view of where those technologies are going to become kind of critical is that we really are seeing, after 5 to 10 years of saying it's going to happen, some real meaningful adoption of rooftop solar panel. And some of the stuff we've looked at is what happens to distribution transformers when you have a lot of homes that have rooftop solar panels. Well, in the summer, these homes become, in Texas, a little bit easier to manage, but they become a lot harder to manage the other 9 months, 8 months a year. And so having some real-time visibility on that will be pretty critical. But also, just as when the first iPhones came out, AT&T's mobile network was hobbled unexpectedly by that, and they spent the next 2 years going, God, how do we fix our grid? Because people are using a product in a way we did not expect, and our grid can't handle it. Mm-hmm. Well, consumers choose to buy products for ways that are baffling to engineers a lot of times. They buy leather upholstery and granite countertops and wood windows and things that don't seem to have a return on investment. But they do it because it makes them feel good. They buy organic food and things like that. So the question is, well, we can try to analyze, well, what point will people decide that it's worth it on rooftop solar panels? The answer is it's a little bit unpredictable, in the sense that people make decisions for a lot of non-economic reasons. But when that happens, is there going to be an AT&T iPhone moment, or will the electric utilities be prepared for the ensuing challenges of having intermittent systems that can kick electricity on or suck it off the grid, sometimes on a minute-to-minute basis? It's a big challenge, and systems that have a lot more real-time visibility are a critical component of that.
Brewster, I'm glad you made that distinction, because one of the things I learned from your staff, talking to your staff, is this impact, right? Everyone thinks like, oh, solar panels are inherently good, and we should all just throw them on our roof and life will be great, right? And what we don't realize is there has to be a two-step process, right? We have to have the adoption of solar panels and consumer doing the solar panels, but the grid also has to evolve, and the technology around the grid has to evolve, because our grid right now, as it stands, isn't kind of wired for the energy input for distributed generation, if you will, right? And these two things have to happen in some kind of sync. If not, I like the metaphor you have, what we think is good could actually turn out to be very bad.
Yeah, and it kind of gets to that. It's hard to see how batteries don't get involved in some scale, whether it's inside of the home or at the at the substation level or things like that. but batteries getting involved or being introduced into the electric system, not for the kind of the classic idea that renewables need to have storage, but really almost as a way to buffer that intermittency.
So you don't have a lot of energy in a hot sunny day surging onto the grid. It surges into the batteries and then eases onto the grid, and you have some kind of control.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, Brewster, Peter and I got to come see your shop a couple months ago. We decided we'd do it when it was cold here and warm there. We're intelligent people. And it was great. And your staff arranged for us to drop in at the homes of a couple of the folks who were participating with your project. And so one of the things that it struck me in conversation with them is that in each of the homes we visited, there was a champion. There was somebody who just really liked this for ideological reasons. And they were the one that was driving adoption. Do you think that we can get to where we need to go based on just providing the right information to ordinary people, or is there always going to be some element of this household champion?
There were definitely, for any kind of mass market, there has to be stuff that the mass market wants. But the mass market on every innovation, whether it's an anti-smoking campaign or new medicines or iPhones, there's always a process where the first people that adopt something are called innovators, and then the next group is the early adopters, and the early majority, late majority, and then the skeptics. And so it's really kind of a bell curve. That's the case on anything that's new, any kind of new idea or new product. So you always want to start with testing something with the early adopters, because those are the people that are going to adopt it, and if they don't like it, it doesn't stand a chance with the rest of the market on anything, whether it's anti-smoking campaigns or new consumer electronics. So we do have a focus significantly on early adopters, but that said, we do research in low-income apartments and senior communities. We have to offer our services in English and Spanish because we have about somewhere between 100 and 125 of our participants who speak Spanish as their preferred language at home. And then, so you got to learn how to communicate with people at all stages of life, and make sure that the services have some relevance and benefit from their subjective experience perspective.
Well, I also heard from a couple of your participants, and we did talk to one of the folks in a senior building, and she was, I would also put her in the category of champion. She was somebody who was making adoption easier for her neighbors. But we spoke to some folks in a single-family home who had put the solar system on, and the wife was a real champion. She wanted solar for environmental reasons, just for all the reasons that people who love solar early and adopt it early love it. But her husband wanted the economic case, and that came from the subsidies you were able to offer. So can you talk about the role of subsidies in getting your experiment off the ground, and how are we going to get widespread adoption on its own economic case without these subsidies?
Sure. Because we are a research institute, follow the classic processes that any product research firm would do, which is if you want to ask people to do stuff for you, the researchers, there has to be something that you have to give back, just from a matter of pure contract law, but also just that's just the model of give and take. So
Sure.
So when we said to people, hey, we need a lot of original research data to understand the impacts, opportunities, benefits, things we need to know about when it comes to high concentrations of rooftop solar panels and electric cars. So we need a lot of data. We will offer you a rebate if you install solar panels or get an electric car if we can have access to all of your anonymized data. That's the trade we make. This is a fairly standard trade. We do some work for appliance makers as well, where people get a free appliance, but we also are measuring how they use the appliance, right? Data, we want data to find out how these things work when they're in real homes and businesses. So there's that element. This is kind of the classic research institute model. Of course, we're going to pay people because that's what research firms do. You get people to try stuff out on behalf of that research firm. But in terms of, okay, well, what happens on the broader market? Like, well, look what's happening in California and Hawaii. Well, at some point, there are a couple of factors by which, whether it's anti-smoking campaigns or smartphones or personal computers or whatever, or fashion, when people adopt stuff, is that they see other people who they know and trust have adopted it first. And there's something called the S-curve of adoption, and that is that an innovation will kick around at like somewhere between 0 to 10, 15%, and it can go on for 10, 20 years at a low level of adoption. But on almost any innovation, when it goes 15%, it goes to 60 really fast. And that's kind of a global experience of almost any kind of innovation. But yeah, you're getting into places like California, Arizona, New Jersey, Hawaii. We're getting pretty close to 15% in certain communities. And so these things don't need subsidies at that point. They start to have their own dynamic, which is that people are adopting it because enough of a critical mass of people have adopted it that networking effects take place.
And that's because they have access to enough neighbors, people they know, so they can ask their questions, or because it suddenly looks normative and people like to follow the norms of their community. What do you think that S-curve happens?
Those are kind of part of the same fabric, which is, why do people who aren't the bleeding edge early adopters adopt any kind of idea or product? And it's because they're Missourians, right? They're show-me people, and so but they also don't want to be shown on almost any kind of new product or service. They don't want to be shown by the government or by some expert on television. They want to be shown by someone they know and trust in their social circle, their work circle. And when that happens, they are overwhelmingly more likely to try it out themselves.
So to understand the Pecan Street model, here at ISEIF, our job is to educate as many consumers as possible in the state of Illinois about the changes that are coming to our grid as these smart meters get rolled out and as people start to have access to that data. So we're looking at broad scale. But when we look at your model, it's very data-centric. And you see that as a way to educate large numbers of people, but it's through getting that case study and getting the data really solid and then promoting what you've learned out in the media. Is that a correct summary of how you use a small study to educate lots of people?
Well, so there, if you look at presidential polling, for example, you'll see in a country of 250 million people that Gallup or some organization polls 371 people over 3 nights, and they come in within a half a percentage point of the actual results of an election, right? And that's just straight statistical modeling. And so you don't need to have 100,000 residents of data to find something out. But also, there's we go deep. So if you get 100,000 residents of data on home electric use, well, you can have a very, very robust model on electric use, but you will likely know next to nothing on appliance level electric use or responses to certain behaviors targeted to certain end uses. To do that, one has to be specifically measuring that, and that's logistically complex, data intensive, time consuming. I mean, if you're going to go in and instrument every appliance or circuit, realistically, you can find out virtually everything you need to find out with a couple of hundred participants, in the same way that Gallup could find that out the presidential election results with 300 Americans all over the U.S. But we can deep dive and answer the questions that haven't been answered before because we're specifically measuring the things that haven't been specifically measured before.
Mm-hmm. So Peter, I want to shift back to you for a second. How, compared to other regions in the country, how is Illinois unique in your research? And what are the conditions that are shaping the emergence of the smart grid here in the Midwest?
It's a great question, Claire. I mean, one of the things that makes it unique, as you well know, right, is the fact that we have this weird 501c3 nonprofit organization called Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Foundation. And, you know, when we look at all the other smart grid rollouts across the country, all the function about communicating about the benefits and the coming of the smart grid was all resided with the utility. In Illinois, because of the statute, we had this organization that was created. And it's a really interesting organization, of course. As people may not know, there's two parts to it. There's a venture capital part that it's investing in Illinois-based smart grid energy-related companies. And then there's this education fund. And, you know, I think it's no secret, about $4 million a year that you have to, have the ability to put out into the marketplace in some way, shape, and form with nonprofits to somehow leverage, you know, progress. And so in a certain way, one of the biggest things that we have is this really unique, you know, funded resources that none of the other rollouts have. I think the other thing that's unique about Illinois is we're not the first ones to do it, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's examples from, you know, like PG&E perhaps is the best example, where in California, where they got lots of pushback from a variety of sources, and things didn't go as smoothly as perhaps they could have when they did a sort of a large rollout of the smart meters. But another thing that's unique about Illinois is we have the benefit of other people's experiences, not only in terms of how do you logistically do the rollout, but also how do you educate people about doing that rollout. And those are some of the things. The other thing that's unique about Illinois is the scale of the rollout here. It's on the larger side. It's one of the bigger rollouts that's been done in the country so far. And I think what's interesting about that and how that relates to what we've been talking about, appliances and smart appliances and the benefits to consumers, hopefully we're starting to create a critical mass of consumers that have this smart grid technology, that have smart meters, that have homes that are smart meter enabled. And we can start seeing a rise on the manufacturing side of smart appliances that use that data, that use that communication function to empower customers in a variety of ways. To me, the big question that remains, and whether it's in Illinois or Texas or California, wherever you want to look, is what's the driver going to be going forward? Is it going to be cost? Is it going to be environmental impact? Is it going to be some sort of moral argument? I think what's really great about Pecan Street is they are getting data specifically on behavior and oftentimes on cost, and what are those cost points, and what are those cost points that will then trip or trigger some kind of preferable behavior, whether it's, you know, real-time pricing cost points or demand response cost points, whatever the case may be. And I think that's really interesting. Also, how are consumers interacting with these new appliances, and how are they using them? It's one thing to have a smart appliance, but if they're not used any differently than traditional appliances, what's the benefit? And I think that's another interesting thing that I find really fascinating about Pecan Street. Another fact is that when, you know, we have the advantage of, again, in Illinois, because we're not first movers, to benefit from the data and the research that places like Pecan Street are doing, or forward-looking utilities like San Diego Power and Gas are doing, Gas and Electric are doing. So we have a couple different benefits, but on the other hand, you know, those couple things aside, we're just like everybody else, right? We're trying to figure this out. We're trying to figure out what's going to be that tipping point to get us to the 15% that'll jump us to the 60%. I think we're all asking ourselves that question. You know, and the answer is I think slowly emerging as the market shifts as well. So those are a few things that I think are unique to Illinois.
So, Brewster, having heard Peter's thoughts about how Illinois is unique, how would you advise us if we're trying to educate consumers, but also to move this market along here where we perhaps don't have the advantage of quite so many sunny days as you, so solar may not be happening quite as quickly here in Chicago. But what data should we be collecting? What do we need to know? Give me some advice so I can do my job better.
I agree with Peter's assessment, both kind of the optimal trend, and then also where Illinois has some real opportunity in this. I mean, it's the classic deal, right? Getting back to looking what's happened in mobile technologies. You know, Apple, everybody says, oh, Apple's always the first one out of the gate. No, they're almost never the first one out of the gate. They wait until something has been sorted out, and then they come out with the best product within that sorted out paradigm. Like, so they waited until everybody had Wi-Fi before they did the iPhone, because only then did you not have to rely on the mobile phone networks to do a lot of the computing functions that would make the iPhone special, or the same with the iPod. So you look at that, you say, okay, what could you do in Illinois that would take advantage of the fact that a lot has already been learned, very little has really been paradigm changing, right? I mean, how has the world changed from smart meters? I think we'd all kind of look and go, I think the average consumer would be like, well, I don't know. I don't know how my service is any different. A good model, again, because it's so recent, mobile telecom, the GPS radio. The GPS radio has been in mobile phones for 20 years now, almost. It wasn't until 2008 that anybody other than the mobile phone company could access what was going on, the data from that GPS radio, which was used to make sure that radio towers, cell phone towers were optimally sited for where customers were. But then in 2008, finally, the mobile phone companies, the phone manufacturers actually started opening up access to data to app makers to access that location data from the GPS radio. That suddenly became a way to, when you're traveling, find a good restaurant or coffee shop near you. You're getting from here to there, but you can also use it to find your friends when you're out in the town. You can use it to automatically tag the location of your photos. All sorts of things that it captured the ability that was already in that device, but we didn't rely on the mobile phone networks to do that, because they were just going to give us more poker games. But instead, suddenly you got 100,000 app developers who had ideas, and 99.9% of those apps were terrible, but some of them really turned out to click. If you look at that on the electric side of smart meters, you say, well, how would that model apply on smart grid? Well, first thing is, the meter is a very sophisticated measurement tool, but 98% of its very significant measurement capabilities are unnecessary for managing the electric grid or for billing. It's a tool that can measure in almost like a millisecond or very rapid cycles. So it could be possible to get OnStar for the home with the meter. But that would not be something that would ever be in the utilities business interest. It's not what they're good at. It would require for them to do a bunch of data center upgrades that are unrelated to their core business operations. But it might be in the interest of an appliance maker or of a Google or their subsidiary Nest. So you look at it and say, okay, how can we do what was done with GPS radios and mobile phones in 2008? How can we do that with meters? That question has not been answered. But the devices are there, and we have the experience from GPS radios and mobile phones to say, if you can create a trusted mechanism whereby the customer can authorize others to access the data from that measurement device at their location, that some fascinating innovations can emerge from that.
I have observed here in Illinois that we aren't quite resolved yet on how to make that third-party access to customer data available with the customer's consent. That we're still actually working on that legally here, and it just, that strikes me as an obstacle to the development of the marketplace. But to both of you, Peter and Brewster, what do you think are, that one may be one, but what's keeping this from happening right now?
I think I just want to emphasize that I really appreciated Brewster's point in terms of the technologies. I think what's really brilliant about, and using Apple as an example, everyone thinks Apple is this sort of like at the forefront, and what was brilliant about Steve Jobs, right, is he knew where the forefront was and to be one step behind it. That's the sweet spot. The forefront is a very dangerous place to be, a very tumultuous place to be. Much safer to be one step behind. And you're seeing that with the rollout of the Apple Watch, right? I mean, lots of watches out there, and they waited and it's going to be interesting to see how that rolls out. I mean, but to me, that the analogy, how you translate that analogy, is it's not the one technology, right? It's the convergence of technologies, and I think that's what we're seeing. And what the smart grid does, as I mentioned, this two-way communication function, is we're having the insertion of this new technology onto the existing grid, and we still don't quite know what to do with it. besides, the sort of base function, just like with the GPS. And I appreciate your analogy there as well, Brewster. It's like, what is this convergence going to be? And in my opinion, also, it's not. I agree with you. It's not going to be utilities, but people don't want to. They still don't want to manage their electricity. They don't. There's going to be some. I think there's going to be some in between space. There's an entrepreneurial space in there, I think, for new companies, whether it's an established company like Google that's going to innovate something, or a new sort of rising company that's going to say, hey, there's a space here that we can fulfill where we're going to do the energy management, demand response. We're going to do it all for the consumer and sort of package it for the consumer. We just came across a really interesting startup company in Portland called IOTIS, and they're doing this they're in this space for multi-tenant buildings and the rental market, which everyone else is like, as you know, I'm sure, Brewster, that's a really difficult place to be because smart meters can't communicate, and it's really difficult. And they're creating new technology, and they're going into that space to manage this for renters who are usually, in a certain way, not part of this whole evolution because they don't have that necessarily, that control or the communication function because of the nature of their buildings. What's going to keep it from, what the barriers are is a lot of things. And what we heard, what we've been hearing a lot, I'd be curious, is cost. And I think that sole focus just on cost is really limiting us. And it's like, how can we create drivers that supersede cost, that aren't going to wait for energy prices to double, triple, quadruple, right, for this to happen? How can we make this happen before that cost? What kind of argument can we make? Well, how can we use data? How can we show that this does have a benefit before that cost price point happens? And again, that's the question I'm asking myself. Is the driver going to be environmental? Is it going to be moral? Is it going to be something else that we don't know? Is it just a cool factor that something cool is going to come onto the market and everyone's going to want it? And that's going to change, create some sort of change. But Bruce, I'm curious about your opinion on the question.
Yeah, that's a good point, Peter, because why would anyone ever make a new product if they couldn't charge a premium for it to account for the risk, right? Pharmaceuticals, for example, they know, man, we have 100 drugs in development, and if 3 of them or 2 of them are successful, that'll pay for all of those medicines that we're testing out. So we want to make money on that to account for our risk, and also that's why we're going to work so hard. So obviously, any kind of new product that's going to be something that's exciting and game-changing, it needs to have a premium charge. It can't enter the market as a low cost. And low cost is only after an innovation is cycled through its premium phase, right? And so then, I think this gets back though. Then, well, so how can you? What's the model of unlocking the data capabilities of a smart meter for the consumer's benefit of things they want to get done? And I think that's almost more of a there's a testing phase, a demonstration, but ultimately it's going to have to be then to show regulators, and they'd have to open it up in the same way that, basically the mobile phone companies, they don't know that they really got a ton of value that they can quantify out of the gates of opening up the GPS radio to app developers. I mean, they didn't get a cut of the apps. Their product became a lot more attractive in the aftermath. But ultimately, it took a while to get the mobile phone carriers to agree to open up the GPS radio access for consumers to authorize app developers to access it. So I think that I think there's inevitably a testing and demonstration phase to persuade ultimately the decision makers who would have to be responsible for authorizing opening up the meter so consumers could authorize third-party providers of smart appliances or connected home devices.
And I think the question, going back to your original question, Claire, to Brewster about, what kind of advice can he give to you? To me, is like, how can we accelerate that process in Illinois? And I know you're working on that to some extent, but it's what kind of public groundswell or technological advances or whatever, what is it that how can we accelerate that process in Illinois and be the leader in that, given that we are benefiting from the experience of other people in this field? But it's a really great question.
Yeah, and I think that there's the only way to do it is to show, the show me part. So that involves demonstration projects with real people. And then you're measuring and quantifying, as well as doing interviews and socio-demographic surveys of these participants. You can measure the impacts customers' satisfaction and the impact on utility equipment like that.
Brewster, I'm curious. Sorry, I don't mean. I have a question. Do you have a dream demonstration project that you haven't done yet?
You know, there are some things. Well, we're about to launch some work for Johannesburg, South Africa, and we're really excited about that. Johannesburg is almost the ideal spot if you're going to want to test out things that could work in Western Europe and North America, and also test out the things that would impact people's lives positively in the developing world. Because in Johannesburg, they have both side by side, right? Yeah, they have a leaning, first world downtown with skyscrapers, and then incredible poverty, the same metro area with people having, in some cases, no access to an electric grid, where they could have a little bit of access to electric services through a solar panel and a used car battery. Their lives would be materially better. So that to me is a really exciting and meaningful piece of work. But also, I think that there is, we want to find out what are the universal truths. So we know that there are some things that we suspect are going to be the same whether you're in Texas, suburban Chicago, Florida, Maine, or Seattle. That is, there's not a Kansas City way to use a microwave oven versus a Los Angeles way to use a microwave oven. And there's not an April way to use a television versus an October way to use television. Those things are going to kind of be not seasonally related, and they're also not going to be geographically dependent within reasonable bounds. But there are some things that are highly climate dependent. Those are things such as solar panel, heating and cooling, some of those things that get into thermal comfort and also distributed generations potential. Knowing how something works, what are the commonalities and differences between Illinois, Maine, North Carolina, and Central Texas, and the West Coast of California. Those are some things that are important to understand.
Are you also looking for the commonalities across demographics? Because one of our charges is to make sure that the population get to come along on this infrastructure shift. And how are you making sure? How are you looking for the universals for folks who don't really have a financial means, or who may be older and therefore are a little more reluctant to adopt a new technology?
Yeah, that's why our work with low-income residents and with the senior community has been so important. So for example, on the work in our senior community, we found that we had some technologies like a Nest thermostat, for example, which we were using for research purposes. Because we could, if they're internet connected, we could use it as part of our demand response trials. But part of the appeal too was that we'd all tested out the Nest and found it was so easy that you could use it without an instruction manual until we installed it in the senior community. This we discovered that a black orb that has no apparent buttons is not as intuitive as we kind of just been led to believe it was, and we ended up having to print out laminated instruction cards and tape it on the wall beneath the thermostat for our participants in that senior community. Once you taught them, they did great with it. And on the flip side, the senior community has been a ton more engaged on their electric use than any other community we've dealt with. And then we had faster sign up from that senior community for people who said, "Oh man, I want to know what my electric use is," because they have time, interest, typically kind of more constrained budgets if they're like on Social Security or pension or both. Mm-hmm. So understanding that there will be some cases where we all say we want to engage electric consumers. 98% of the market does not want to be an engaged electric consumer, but there are parts of the market that have turned out, particularly our work with seniors, we want to be.
And I think that's a great point, Bruce. I think that's one of the things that makes this work so difficult, right? And when we asked that initial question, Claire, about what success looks like, it looks like different things for different populations. And some of those issues for success are overall like, hey, we all want to reduce environmental impact, right? certain segments of the population, cost is a lot bigger. Their energy costs are a lot bigger issue than other parts of the population. For some parts of the population, technology adoption is going to be much easier for other parts of the population. So we have this kind of mosaic that we're trying to fit together. At the same time, you have these larger drivers, moving, whether it's energy impacts or cost or smart grid rollout happening all at the same time. It's a multi-variable design problem, as I like to say, and a pretty fascinating one. But I think the one thing I've realized is there's no one size fits all. It's a question of how do we weave these things together and take things we learn from one segment of the population and see if they fit with another part of the population and vice versa to get the most effective solution possible.
Yeah, Claire, you look at the car companies, right? Why do they make cars that have an incredible variety of options, whether it's paint color or leather versus fabric upholstery, or pickup trucks versus SUVs versus fuel-efficient small sedans versus luxury sedans? Well, that's because the market has this incredible variety of preferences, and so the car companies are a good example of. They understand that there are cars I see on the road. I'm like, who in the world would ever want a car like that? The car companies know precisely who wants a car like that, and so they make it. They make that purple car that looks like a spaceship, because there are tens of thousands of customers. That's the car they want. That's them.
There was a question I saw recently in an article I read that asked, why is the smart home still so dumb? Which is, and the example that it gave, it was a UK article, and they said their water heater had been leaking into their basement for weeks. And while they have a relatively smart home, they have a smart meter, they're getting this data, nothing in the data told them your water heater is using a lot more energy right now than it usually does. And so I thought it was a wonderful question, and it just pointed to the development that still has to occur in this market to get to something that might actually be useful to a lot of people. So let me just throw that question to both of you. Why is the smart home still so dumb?
I think there's two, in my opinion, there's two reasons. One is a technology answer, right? And we have this thing called the Internet of Things, which is this idea that we're going to embed sensors in all different kinds of things. So your water heater would have 5 sensors in it, and it'd all be talking to some kind of your network, whether that's your Wi-Fi network or your smart grid network, or those two things become the same thing. So I think one is a technological issue. Is we're just starting to move in that direction. I think the other thing is it's been a price thing. It hasn't cost us, we innovate where there is cost savings or where there's money to be made. And for a long time, because or resources in general, and water and energy, specifically here in Chicago, are so relatively inexpensive for many people, there hasn't been the move in that direction. We haven't cared enough. I don't know, those two answers are things that come immediately to mind. Brewster?
Yeah, let's take the water heater example. That's the fascinating stuff. We're actually doing work in water now, and in fact, by this time next year, we'll be managing more residential water use data in field trials in Texas than all Texas water utilities combined. And we've already learned from our first phase of rollout of those systems that measure water use, is that whether it's electric use or water use, if you had a water heater that was leaking, well, how would one find that out? Well, it's you need to measure often enough to, on the electric side, for example, or the water side, to see that there was something happening at times where there should not be anything happening. Mm-hmm. That, like, you could measure specifically the water heater, and if you measure the water heater specifically, you'd see that it was running more often than it should. But if you weren't measuring the water heater specifically and you're only getting your electric use data every 30 days, well, how in the world would you know that the water heater that it counted for your higher electric use? There would not be this data signal in once every 30-day data that would tell you, oh, I've got something wrong with my water heater because I used 3% more electricity this month than I did last month. No, there would be no indicator from that very high-level data. But if you saw data even just from, say, the water. Let's take if you're measuring your water use, and you saw that you were using water at 3 in the morning, at 3:30 in the morning, at 4 in the morning, and 4:30 in the morning, at 5 in the morning, that should not be happening. And particularly, it shouldn't be happening if it's going to be in like a 2 or 3 gallon. That's a data signature that if you're measuring water, every minute or every hour, that data signal will jump out like a flashing red light. It would tell you you've got some kind of problem, water being used in a pattern that is abnormal. That's a pattern that would be something like a toilet flapper or a water heater issue. But the first thing you have to do is measure the use often enough. So why hasn't that happened so far? Well, it hasn't happened so far because how does that make electric service more reliable? How does that make water service more reliable? It doesn't, right? It doesn't impact electric or water reliability one iota, even though it potentially could cause tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of property damage for the consumer.
Right.
Almost all of us know that people who've had a water leak in their home, if we haven't had it happen to ourselves, those could be really devastating, either economically or from property damage. So why it hadn't happened is we haven't had that inflection point where the GPS radio has been opened up to third parties. It's all
right,
and the data has been in the hands of the people who installed the measurement equipment, and that makes total sense to me. It's not a criticism, but they're measuring as often as they've needed to provide reliable service.
And I think we're in a different place. I mean, I think we'll have the smart home when the benefits, tip the scale in favor of overcoming the stasis of having a dumb home. And we're still realizing what those benefits are. I think so far we've only measured those benefits in terms of cost, but I think we're starting to move toward an issue where we're valuing resources in a different way, and where perhaps there's a moral argument or a future argument, or hey, we need to conserve these resources for them to be around, in conjunction with rising costs. So I think it's starting to happen, and I think also it's a technology part where we just haven't. I mean, look at the thermostat, right? I mean, the Nest thermostat. Like, this is, it's a cool thing, but the reason it's a cool thing is because that industry really hadn't significantly innovated for so many years, and suddenly, bam, there's this interesting innovation that comes along, and suddenly ignites everyone's imaginations.
Yeah, it's funny, like in the case of the Nest, right? You're like, well, I'm not thinking from an industrial design perspective, it's a beautiful product. But we've been testing a number of them out in the field. Nest is one of our member companies, but what we found is that the most popular feature, and they found this too, is that you can change your temperature in bed on your phone, right? It has nothing to do with how the product looks. It's got a really awesome app that connects over the Wi-Fi network directly with the thermostat and provides greater comfort and convenience. That turns out to be the most popular feature with our participants when it's out in the real world.
And all the energy geeks are like, we're all like, oh, it'll save energy and help you manage. And it's like people just want the ability to change the thermostat from their bed,
want
right?
to warm up the house before you get out of bed. That's all people really want.
Yes, the only energy product I brought home that my wife has found to be useful.
She's gonna like the one that tells her that the refrigerator is about to break. I'm waiting for those. So some more frequent data collection and moving that data to the folks who can do something with it, I guess, is our takeaway from this conversation today.
Absolutely.
Well, Brewster McCracken from Pecan Street, I want to thank you very much for your time today, and Peter Nicholson from Foresight Design Initiative. I think we're going to wrap things up here. We're at our time. Thank everybody for watching, either now or in the future. And if you missed part of the broadcast today, you can watch it anytime on the Smart Power Illinois YouTube channel. We have more events coming up about the future of the smart home here in Chicago. We have more events coming up on our Surge series throughout the year, and we have an in-person event about the future of the smart home in Chicago on April 30th. So you can follow us on Twitter, and you can look to our website for information on upcoming events. Until next time, thank you both.
Thanks.
Thanks, Claire.